Hello, welcome back to the Deep 404. It seems like the writing is starting to appear on the wall for Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu. There is growing pressure and calls surfacing within Israel for him to resign his position as Prime Minister of Israel. This is happening as the US and Israel diverge on the response to Gaza, in particular the concept of humanitarian pauses or perhaps even a ceasefire being called for by some people. Benjamin Netanyahu is very much against a ceasefire, even the use of that term. Joe Biden has called for a 3-day pause. He's mentioned in an interview that Biden has called for even a longer pause than that with some Israeli government representatives. He doesn't specify who that he's called for a longer pause for. Although, interestingly, when Biden was pressed on a ceasefire, he gave a resolute no to that no ceasefire would be called for. It's an interesting play on terms and words here. A 3-day or 5-day pause for humanitarian aid to be moved into Gaza and for hostage negotiations to proceed. It seems like it would be acceptable, but the concept of an actual ceasefire for an extended period of time, not something which Netanyahu is willing to accommodate at this stage, and not something that Biden is willing to mention at this stage. As I say, the pressure is rising in Israel against Benjamin Netanyahu. Haaretz Israel's longest published newspaper has articles questioning just how far Benjamin Netanyahu will go to avoid responsibility for the October 7 Hamas attacks. That's their headline. They report that he has ignored warnings from his own military for months preceding the attack. In a second headline published today in Haaretz, the headline states, Netanyahu sets Israel on collision course with Biden over the Gaza war. And the sub-headline is, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu believes a lengthy war in Gaza will alleviate criticism and keep him in power. More importantly, he thinks it will allow him to spread the blame, shedding all personal responsibility for the October 7th devastation. So this is of importance, the fact that these are headlines in Israel's longest published newspaper, very popular newspaper, Haaretz. That this is occurring, and this is interesting because this is occurring during a response or an offensive against Hamas, which Netanyahu is leading. And the response itself within Israel is considered to be popular, it's supported. So while there is a popular public Israeli perception of the response and the incursion into Gaza and the attack on Hamas, Netanyahu's popularity and approval rating is on the decline. There are polls out, recent polls, which are indicating this. Even the Israel Hayom newspaper, which is a right-wing paper, which the owner of which is a supporter of Netanyahu, even that newspaper has called on Netanyahu to resign at the end of or the close of this war, whenever that should occur. Public support for him is in decline, and a lot of this, at least in part, a lot of this comes from the cloud of corruption which is still hanging over the head of Netanyahu. On the 21st of November in 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu was then officially indicted for breach of trust, accepting bribes, fraud, and that led to him relinquishing a number of his positions in the government. His trial began in May of 2020, and that trial is continuing now. It hasn't been resolved. So all this time while he has been Prime Minister again. And remember, Netanyahu is the longest-serving Prime Minister in Israel's history. He has been serving as Prime Minister since 2022. He previously held the office from 1996 to 1999, and then again from 2009 to 2021. So 16 years he's been in that role there. He, in terms of the corruption cases surrounding him, there were 4 main cases brought. One of them has been dismissed. Of the 3 remaining cases, they are identified as Case 1000, Case 2000, and Case 4000. In Case 1000, Mr. Netanyahu was accused of accepting nearly $300,000 in gifts in 2007 to 2016 from Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan and Australian billionaire James Packer. In return, the prosecutors state that the Prime Minister acted on Mr. Milchan's behalf, including pressuring the Finance Ministry to double the duration of tax exemption for expatriate Israelis like the producer after they returned to the country from abroad. The indictment also accuses Mr. Netanyahu of lobbying the US government to help Mr. Milchan renew his American visa and assisting with a merger deal involving a TV channel partly owned by Mr. Milchan. Interestingly, James Packer is not accused of receiving anything in return for his gifts. They are not on trial, and he's denied any wrongdoing. James Packer is an interesting character himself, son of Kerry Packer. Kerry Packer, when he was alive, was Australia's richest man in the media industry. A huge character on the Australian scene. James, attempting to follow in his father's footsteps and never quite reaching the heights that his father did, perhaps not quite right for the role in terms of personality. Kerry, very hard-nosed businessman. James seems like a softer personality. Anyhow, the second case, Case 2000, against Mr. Netanyahu, he allegedly discussed a quid pro quo arrangement in 2014 with Arnon Moses, a publisher of Yediot Aharonot, one of Israel's leading newspapers. Under the deal, in the indictment says Mr. Netanyahu was to receive supportive coverage from the paper. In exchange, he's accused of agreeing to consider enacting legislation that would curb the strength of Israel Hayom, a rival newspaper owned by Sheldon Adelson. Interestingly, Israel Hayom and Sheldon Adelson is a supporter of Mr. Netanyahu. But, as I mentioned before, even Israel Hayom has called for President Netanyahu to resign at the end of the Gaza conflict. Case 4000 relates to a telecom mogul named Shaul Elovitch and his wife, who granted favours to Mr. Netanyahu in the hope that Mr. Netanyahu would not obstruct to the Elovitch's business interests. So there are a number of corruption charges there, and this is part of the reason why in Israel he is not favoured as Prime Minister. Why is Biden stepping away? Why are they talking about this head-to-head, this clash or this divide forming between Netanyahu and President Biden? There are a number of reasons. least of which now the triumvirate of President Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin have all had a number of Palestinian human rights organizations forming to jointly sue the three of them, to file cases against them for failing to prevent an unfolding genocide. Now, whether those cases will be successful or not will come down in a large part to the interpretation of the word genocide, which I imagine they will struggle to have any activity by the Israelis classed as genocide. But anyhow, just an indication that things like this are starting to happen. There is also in the US a growing sense that while, yes, what Hamas did on October the 7th was bad, that the ongoing indiscriminate bombing of Gaza by the Israelis is also bad. And from sampling social media, Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, there also seems to be a growing pushback among the US Western public. People are being tired of being called anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel's response to the Hamas attacks. It seems as though any sort of criticism of the bombing, the scale of the bombing, whether it's proportionate or not, is immediately seeing people labelled as being anti-Semitic, and people starting to push back on that, and arguing that they're not anti-Semitic, they're anti the heavy-handed bombing and killing of children and civilians. Interesting point Douglas McGregor mentioned is that there are a number of people of Catholic faith in Gaza as well, who are not supporters of Hamas, but they are, just by geography and living in that region, tied up in this conflict and suffering as part of this conflict. Also in the West, there's criticism of, and in Israel, criticism of how Benjamin Netanyahu is managing the question of the Israeli hostages, those people who were taken hostage on October the 7th. The public feel that the current response is not considerate enough of the hostages, that Netanyahu is not working tirelessly enough to secure the release of those hostages, and that the ongoing bombing, assault and ground offensive may not be the best way to secure their release and to ensure their safety in the Gaza area. Now, it's not clear that Benjamin Netanyahu or the Israeli Defense Force or the Israeli military know the location of the Israeli and hostages of other nationalities who have been taken hostage by Hamas. There has been talk that perhaps even one of the higher profile hostages, that her death may have been caused, her ultimate death may have been caused by bombing or shelling by Israeli forces, where they were not aware of where her and possibly other hostages were being held. I can't corroborate that, but you can imagine that if Israel is attempting to destroy Hamas locations and is using widespread bombing across the small area of Gaza, that the risk of targeting a Hamas location where Israeli hostages are being held is a real risk. and something that could have the unexpected consequence of leading to the death of hostages through Israeli bombing. The US, why is there perhaps some sort of divide forming between Biden in the US and Netanyahu in Israel? As I mentioned this yesterday, the differing opinions on Hezbollah and how Hezbollah should be treated, and what if I choose my words here, what Israel may see as the opportunity and the US may see as the risk of Israel escalating in southern Lebanon and enticing Hezbollah into the conflict. There is some reporting out at the moment that at the present time, the US administration is seeing Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, his two recent statements as being level-headed and non-inflammatory and not as escalatory as the recent missile strikes by Israel into southern Lebanon. In reporting that the US administration doesn't feel that Hezbollah are looking for war at this time. And so the US concerned that if Israel thinks there might be an advantageous situation here by enticing Hezbollah into a fight, which would then draw the US in to protect Israel, Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu may see this as an opportunity to rid themselves of the Hezbollah threat by enticing them into a fight and then having the US step in to deal with Hezbollah. Again, the US not interested in that at the moment. They're only partially prepared for conflict in the Middle East with some aircraft carriers there, but those aircraft carriers give you some ability, but they don't give you ground forces. Putting ground forces into Lebanon is a major escalation, something that the US would be hesitant to do, as once that begins, they then have committed themselves to this fight and they will start to lose troops. Public opinion in the US will rise against the Biden administration. And with US troops committed to fight Hezbollah, there will then be a far higher chance of the likes of Syria and Iran and Turkey becoming engaged if they feel that both Hamas and Hezbollah are being attacked by Israel and the US. So while Biden has been requesting a 3-day pause, to try to find some middle ground, perhaps between a ceasefire and cooling things down, this has not been accepted. White House spokesperson John Kirby has come out and said that the Israeli Defense Forces are allowing a 4-hour-a-day window, a pause or a window. They're announcing 3 hours before that pause of when the pause will occur. And so I don't have the detail on that, but that leads me to think that perhaps the pauses don't occur at the same time each day. They might be occurring at different times during the day. And you can see that the US are trying to make some attempts here, but then balancing amongst not upsetting the very powerful pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. If the pro-Israel lobby is not in support of a ceasefire, then Biden doesn't want to be seen to be working towards a ceasefire, as he will then lose support of the Israel lobby in the US. Now, coming into his election in 2024, that is not something that he wants to do. Not something he wants to do at all. Now, all of this becomes more interesting or concerning when you start to consider Israel's nuclear capability. Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has responded to a statement from a junior Israeli government official. He was asked, Heritage Minister Amhei Eliyahu from a far-right party of the coalition government was asked in a radio interview about a hypothetical nuclear option, and Eliyahu had replied, "That's one way." Now, Maria Zakharova, Russian's foreign ministry spokeswoman, has said this raises a huge number of questions because it appears as though someone from the Israeli government has admitted that Israel has nuclear weapons. Now, Israel doesn't openly admit to having nuclear weapons. It's not like the US and Russia and India and Pakistan who, openly admit they have nuclear weapons. Israel doesn't. It has this policy of ambiguity, not committing to having nuclear weapons. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but you don't want to test things and find out that we do. However, in 1986, Mordechai Vanunu, an Israeli nuclear technician who had been employed at the Dimona nuclear facility, went public with information about the technical capacity of Israel to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. Based upon this and other sources of information, it is estimated that Israel has somewhere between 80 and 90 nuclear warheads, 50 of them perhaps for delivery via ballistic missiles, and 30 or 40 of them capable of being delivered via aircraft. So, while I haven't looked on the map to see what the range is, if the Israelis are able to deliver these via aircraft and ballistic missiles, then you're probably talking, I don't know, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometre radius around Israel would be the target area, which brings into play Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan. So it's if that happens, if things progress to a stage where Israel feels existentially threatened, then there is this possibility of things escalating to that point. Now, it's not something that at this stage is on the cards, but it's something to just be aware of, that capability and the fact that a situation could arise where Israel feels like it is existentially threatened. And that the topic of existential threat is one which we can also sort of apply to the Ukraine and Russian conflict. Now, and this has been the reasoning given by the Russians for their invasion of Ukraine. It was because they believed that if Ukraine was to become a NATO nation, then Russia would be under existential threat because they would have NATO nuclear missiles ultimately positioned right on their border and right on their doorstep and easily within immediate range of Moscow. So that concept of existential threat, one which now has shifted from not being Russia being in existential threat, but Ukraine moving into that position now. There are leadership squabbles and fights erupting in Kiev at the moment. The relatively new Minister of Defense for Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, has reportedly been preparing for the dismissal of 3 high-profile roles: the dismissal of the commander of the Joint Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Sergei Naev. He may be becoming one of the main defendants in the case that concerns the defense of the Kherson region in 2022. Second dismissal case being raised for the commander of the Operational Strategic Group of Troops, Tavria, Alexander Tarnavsky. And a third one, the commander of the medical forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Tatiana Ostashenko. So the Minister of Defense is looking like he is cleaning house. At the same time, we have Ukrainian President Zelensky and his primary advisor, Yermak, looking to oust General Zaluzhny. Reportedly, Yermak has travelled to Washington this week to talk to the Biden administration to try to garner support to remove Zaluzhny. And so there is then, on the other hand, talk that Zaluzhny may be recognising that he has an opportunity now to take the command of Ukraine from President Zelensky. Why? The talk is that Zelensky has cancelled the elections that were scheduled for 2024, claiming that it can't be done because it's a war. Many countries have been in cases of war and they've still held elections. However, the thinking is that he understands, this is President Zelensky, understands that his position is now weak, that the counteroffensive that commenced in June 2023 was a failure, and that he is not going to be able to win an election, and he is concerned that General Zaluzhny would become a candidate and that he would win. So by cancelling the elections, he stops Zaluzhny having that chance. Now, there are talks that the US is looking for a ceasefire in Ukraine. So while they won't mention ceasefire in Israel, they are talking about a ceasefire in Ukraine. And this being because the US have now got two fights on their hands. They've got the Middle East. They would like some time to be able to go and sort out the Middle East. They would like some time and have a bit of a spell from Russia to be able to restock, rearm, build some supplies, rearm Ukraine, buy Ukraine some time to, in the rear, establish some serious defensive positions, which is something which the Ukrainians, under the guidance of President Zelensky, have not achieved in his outright desire to retain or regain Bakhmut and the desire to hold on to Avdiivka. Energy has not been put into, or forethought has not been put into, what would happen if the Russians were to gain the upper hand and start to push the Ukrainians back, as is now happening across the line, and the defensive work that should be done in that case so that they can hold off that Russian move to the west. So that hasn't been that hasn't been done, that defensive work. So this puts Zelensky into a tough position where he's unable to demonstrate success. The Russians are now starting to push back against him, and because he hasn't prepared, he needs to, he's going to see military defeat increase. So the US would like a ceasefire to give the Ukrainians some time to be able to build those defences. The thinking is that President Zelensky is not the person to negotiate a ceasefire with Russia. He's openly ruled this out before. He's ruled out negotiations. A lot of people just no longer trust that he's capable. The feeling is that it's time to move him on. And so the US may be looking at Zaluzhny because he's been seen as a strong commander. He's pushed back against Zelensky in the past. And perhaps Zaluzhny, given his reputation for concern for his troops, demonstrated by his desire not to engage in a further offensive, he might be able to sell to the Ukrainian people the idea of a ceasefire and have it not look like a complete failure. That's the thinking anyhow. Whether he would be successful with that, who knows? The big thing that in all of this thinking and talking about what might happen, who might lead Ukraine into ceasefire discussions with Russia, seems to be missing one small point. And that point is that Russia may have other ideas. So while the US and Ukraine might like the idea of a ceasefire, pardon me, for a year or two, they're going to get their production lines humming for producing shells, and they can rearm, have a breather, restock. There's a very, very, very real chance that Russia and President Putin will just say no to any requests for a ceasefire. You guys can stop shooting if you like. We're not going to. Russia has been clear, unwaveringly clear right from the start, that they want to see a demilitarized Ukraine, a denazified Ukraine, and that Ukraine will not become part of NATO. And ideally not part of the EU. But without those demands being met, Russia has given no indication that they will stop until those demands are met. So again, this is a situation where it feels like perhaps in their own Western Ukrainian thought bubble area, echo chamber, they've got a great plan. It sounds good to them. Yeah, we'll grab a ceasefire. We'll swap out Zelensky and put Zelensky in there, and the Ukrainians will like that. We get a bit of a break, and we can come back, we can fight, and we take the Russians on later on. But it appears as though not a great deal of thought has gone into, well, what do the Russians think about this? Why would the Russians want a ceasefire? The Russians are now gaining the upper hand across the line. The only area, it seems at the moment, if you're looking at Telegram channels or Twitter or the mapping that's being done, the only area that it seems like Ukraine is having some semblance of success at the moment is in the Kherson region, where near Krinky, Ukrainian troops are coming across the river and the islands onto the east bank of the Dnieper. But once they're getting there, they're being unloaded upon by the Russians. Reports again today of heavy flamethrowers and Fab 500s and artillery and tube fires being just launched at these Ukrainians getting across the Dnieper River in just to the north of the Kherson area. This isn't a successful adventure in this area for Ukraine. They are just losing troops and not gaining anything here. They are not giving the Russians a particularly hard time in this area. And that's the only area on the front line that it seems that the Ukrainians are having success at the moment. The Russians are pushing back around Bakhmut now. As Avdiivka is drawing resources, Bakhmut is weakening in terms of Ukraine's ability to hold where it was holding the line there. Kleshchiivka and Andriivka are now falling back into Russian control where the Ukrainians had advanced before. Heavy fighting still around Robotne and Verbova, but again, no ground being made there by Ukraine. Up in the north, from Krasny Liman up, there is reports of just grinding incremental positional advances by the Russians and loss of territory for the Ukrainians. So given that current scenario, given that in areas like Avdiivka, where the heaviest of fighting, or perhaps the Ukrainians are fighting the heaviest to retain Avdiivka, areas like that, the approach to winter is going to make the holding of those areas far harder for the Ukrainians. The main supply road into Avdiivka is under some level of Russian fire control. It's under the Russians have the ability to fly FPV drones at anything that goes along that road. They don't yet have fully consolidated fire control to the level of being able to position tanks to take fire over the road, or anti-tank guided missiles, but they're not far away from that. There have been moves made. On the map here, there have been reports of additional advances near Stepov here, this area to the north of Avdiivka, with the Russian plans here to be moving to take Berichi, this little township here. Ultimately, the Russians wanting to get down here and taking Semenivka and maybe coming up to get Orlivka. Then Avdiivka is effectively, it is cut off. And already, as I say, the reports from this area are not good from the Ukrainians. They talk about just sustaining constant artillery, being under constant fire from the Russians. So even in areas like this where the Ukrainians are fighting very hard, as winter approaches, their supply lines are being cut off. They're going to find it difficult to get through the winter. Their conditions will be far worse than the Russians, who have, in the case of Avdiivka, Donetsk city right behind them, supply lines, the ability to rotate in and out, new reserve troops, keep them fresh. It's going to be far easier for the Russians. So Ukraine, having real troubles. Even in Europe, the Stratfor company has conducted some questions and surveys among top officials of the US, Great Britain, Canada, Turkey, the EU, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, on the topic of how would you feel about the forceful scenario of the departure of President Zelensky and his entourage. And the data has shown that if the loss of Zelensky at the head of Ukraine leads to a long-term settlement of the Ukrainian-Russian armed conflict, 62% are ready to allow such a solution. So Zelensky, internal challenges, the population of Ukraine, while we don't hear a great deal about it in the Western media, must be turning against him now, just with the continued loss of their young men, with no success in the last 6 months. Now with the Western leaders of the nations who have been supporting Ukraine, indicating that if they can get to a long-term settlement, and that means Zelensky has to go, most of them are okay with that. Interesting in there is just the acceptance now of the long-term settlement is something as being seen as okay by the leaders of the USA, Great Britain, Canada, Turkey, UAE, Saudi Arabia. If you went back a year, that question would have just been pushed out the door. Settlement would not have been an option. It would have been the destruction of Russia would have been what they were talking about. Now that's not being talked about anymore. The conflict has gone from one where the West thought that they could do that, they could weaken Russia and perhaps even claim land off Russia and have this be a major victory, and then put Russia out of the picture and then move on to China. Instead, the Ukrainian conflict has backfired for the West. It has strengthened Russia. It has weakened the NATO alliance. It has depleted the NATO and Western stockpiles. And now with the Israel-Palestinian conflict heating up, drawing further resources, the Ukrainian situation is becoming a problem for the West and for the US. And This is leading to, as we've discussed recently on the show, this is leading to change coming in Europe in a number of areas. There is looking more and more like the government of Germany will be swapped out in 2024. The Slovakian government just went for one. Fico got in there on the platform of not providing any more support to Ukraine, any more military support. France. Macron is safe. Well, until 2027 is the next election in France. He can't hold the presidency in that term, so someone else will be replacing him. But clearly there are challenges there as well. So things looking grim for Zelensky. Things beginning to look grim for Netanyahu. The coming weeks in Ukraine and possibly weeks in Israel will be telling here. There are Israeli ex-military and ex-government sources who themselves are now saying they believe that Israel has another couple of weeks that it can sustain the current form of response in this heavy bombing campaign and the ground forces. And after that period of a few weeks, they believe that in the West, the tide will have turned and that they will have lost support and that approach will then need to stop. Now, that estimated it being a few weeks away. If they're right, that may then coincide with a change in approach in Israel, which may be the catalyst for there to be change in leadership. If the position at that time, if the fact that Israel, as I was saying before, if Netanyahu and Israel has to step back and out of Gaza without being able to clearly demonstrate success, that again may just push his approval ratings even lower, because the Israeli population is approving of the response at this stage. So he's caught in some weird, usually a president in the case of a war where the war is supported by the population, their approval will be going up and up and up. And this is something American presidents talk about. A war president never gets voted out. Here, it seems as though Benjamin Netanyahu is bucking the trend, and he's a war president in a popular war for his nation, but his popularity isn't riding the wave of that. All right, I think I'll leave that there for tonight. If you've watched it this far, I hope you're enjoying the channel. Please drop some comments in, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.